Every method in your interface is going to be abstract. We're not going to have, we can have a method that is not abstract in our interfaces too. We'll see that at the end. But the normal criteria here is it's like a contract. That's what we have to understand. Say if I have a shape interface, I can have some three abstract methods like get input, print output, and calculate area. So these three methods are very abstract. So I'm not going to give you any definition inside my interface. And if you're going to have an implementation of a shape, it's mandatory that you provide the implementation of all these three methods. So interfaces, you declare that with the keyword interface, and then you give your interface name, shape. And one thing you have to keep in mind here is every method is abstract in an interface. The next important thing is you cannot create an object of your interface. You can't instantiate an object. And all the methods in your interfaces are of type public and abstract. You can also have variables for your interface. All the variables are static and final. Interface can contain only abstract methods. Interface cannot be instantiated. Interface cannot have a constructor. See, you cannot create an object for an interface, so there is no point in having a constructor for an interface. Interface can contain only static and final variables that are public. So these are by default. When you create a variable in an interface, it will be static and final by default. If you create a method in an interface, by default it will be public and abstract. And when a class implements an interface, it is mandatory for the class to give implementation for all the abstract methods in your interface. Another final important thing is a class can implement many interfaces. So we'll take up this example. We'll have this interface shape and three important methods for an interface: input, compute area, and display area. And see, when you're talking about implementing an interface, class square implements shape, class rectangle implements shape. So when it implements an interface, you should provide the definition for all these methods. And the notation you're seeing on the board is the UML notation for interfaces implementation. You call that relationship to be realization. We have already seen one of the relationships, that is inheritance, generalization. So this kind of an implementation of interfaces, you call that realization, and you denote that like that with respect to UML standards, a dashed arrow mark. We'll take another example for an interface. You know you use buttons, right, in your applications. Say you create a button in your application. What is a button? It can be used for when you complete filling a form, you can say you reserved a ticket. You can click on this button and say reservation is done. So when you click on this button, there can be certain message, right? When you click on a reserve button, what is the message that will be displayed to the user? If the seat is available, you're going to say reservation successful. So we'll have a message here, reservation successful. Likewise, a button can also be part of your cancellation form, right? So you want to cancel a ticket, so there will also be a button, and you'll have this text cancel. And when you want to cancel a ticket, you'll click on this button. So what will be the message that will be available to the user? If the process is smooth, you'll say cancellation successful or something like that. So you'll be using this button in every form that you're creating. And as an application programmer, in this form, say you want this button to be in red color or green color. Say it's reserving, right? So you can say in green color, you want the button display to be. Whereas in cancellation, you want that button to be in red color to alert the user. You define the properties of the button or the working of the button based on the application you are in. What I'm trying to say here is you have a button, and the implementation of the button depends on the application on the programmer. Please have that in mind. So in an application, the button can be of red color. In the same application, another form, button can be of green color, and the display message that happens when you click a button is also different. So now for a button, I can have some methods defined. For instance, set button color. What methods I can define for a button? Set button color. Because whenever I use my button, I have to set what color it is in my application, in my form. I can also have set button text. What is set button text? Say cancel is the button text, reserve is the text. So what text should be available on my button? So that is another thing. Likewise, I can also go with on click. So if I click this button, what should happen? So this is on click. That is another method. When I click on the reserve button, it says reservation successful. When I click on the cancel button, it says cancellation successful. So button is very abstract, right? So button is abstract, and you have this button to be defined as an interface. You can define the button to be an interface. How will you define a button to be an interface? Use the keyword interface, and then you say button. See, I will not be able to give any definitions for set button color or set button text within the interface, right? Because it depends on the application. Purely, the application will implement all these methods. So you can define an interface for the button. You can put all these methods to be abstract here. That is void, set button, and things like that. So whenever you go and implement this button in a class, you are going to provide the all these three implementations are mandatory. So set button color, set button text, and on click. You understood the concept here. So whenever you are going to use a button in any of the forms in your entire project, it is mandatory for you to define the text, the color, and then the on click event for the button. So now button becomes an interface, and when you implement the button, you have to provide implementation for all the methods. So that is our theory. Now we'll go and have some coding done, and we'll see how this one works. So what we'll do is we'll create this button class, button interface, and then we'll see how we'll implement things. So let us go and create this button interface. To create an interface, use the keyword interface, and then you give button. And then you can have all methods in interface should be abstract. So it is void set button color. Okay. And then void set button text. Okay. Something like that. And then void on click. You have an interface, so you put all these methods. So in your project, if you're going to use this button interface, you have to provide the implementation for all these methods here. So how can you go and implement this? Is I can have a class reservation, something like that. It will implements button. So when class implements this interface, say the keyword is implements here, not extends. When a class implements this interface, it should provide the definition for all these methods. It should override it. So what you do is you go to source and then you go and override implement methods and click OK. So you see all the methods are added to my class. If you don't implement any of the methods here, then you will get an error for your class. So it's mandatory you go and implement. So for reservation, I can have some button color, right? I'll have string color and string text, something like that. So what I will do is I'll set my button color here to some default value. So color is equal to blue. It's a string, so we'll give that in quotes. And then we can have text to be set, right? So we can have text is equal to some value. Say reserve is the reserved ticket, something like that. Finally, on click. So when he clicks that reserve button, there can be some message that is thrown. So what you can do is we can have a sysout message here that is ticket reserved or something like that. Okay. So what we are understanding here is the implementation can vary based on the class where you are implementing an interface. That's why it's abstract, first of all. Again, when you want to implement this for a class cancellation, how can you implement that? What you do, you just have a class cancellation or something like that, and then you use implements. What is that it's going to implement? Button. So once when another class implements button, it should also override all the methods. So how will you override? You go to source, override implement methods, and then you click OK. So now it will override. Now you can have some methods for your cancellation to string button color. I can define some button color string text. Something like that. So you can define this button color to be blue or red here. So just defining some button color here. And then button text is cancel a ticket text. Yes, cancel ticket, something like that. And then finally on click, this on click will do something else. It will print a message ticket cancellation is successful. So let's say, so we have reservation implementing the button interface, cancellation implementing the button interface. I know there are a lot of pieces missing here. When you have a button, you will just drag and drop that button shape, and then when you click on it, you'll be taken to an on-click method. You'll be writing what on-click is. So that is the actual implementation that will happen if you have worked with some GUI-based applications where you'll have this toolbox and things will work. This is not to that level, but just to understand how an interface works. See, by default, all the methods in the interface are public and abstract. I'm not giving public abstract like I did in the abstract class. By default, everything is public and abstract. So no need to mention public abstract here. Okay, so is this clear? Have you completed coding this? So you understood the difference between an abstract class and interface. They say that is one of the important interview questions. See, in abstract class, you know partial implementation for some of the methods in your class. So you can go ahead and give the implementation of some of the methods are common to all the objects or all the classes that will extend it. Whereas in an interface, as I told you, the button object or button interface you can think of. It depends purely on where it is getting implemented. So it's very abstract. You cannot go and give definitions inside your interface. So in such cases, you'll go in for an interface. And one more difference between an abstract class and an interface is abstract class doesn't support multiple inheritance, right? A class cannot extend multiple classes. Whereas using interfaces, you will get some kind of multiple inheritance. A class can extend multiple interfaces. So these are some of the important differences. In an abstract class, you can have all the variables to be normal variables like protected int A, private int B, any static variables. Whereas in an interface, all the variables that declare should be only public and final. So you can have a constructor for the abstract class, but that constructor should not be defined abstract. But you cannot have a constructor for your interface. That is for sure. You cannot create an object of your abstract class. You cannot create an object of your interface. An interface can extend another interface. An interface can extend, inherit another interface. So we'll go and see what is this. An interface can inherit another interface. So we'll go with this button. Say I want to create a two-dimensional or three-dimensional button, a 3D button. A 3D button will inherit all the qualities of a button, but it might have one more method, abstract method. So 3D button is also an interface. So say 3D, 3 dimension. I just use 3 dimension. Extends. See, it is extending, inheriting button. So you will have an interface extending another interface. So what a three-dimensional button can have is, say you can get some location for a 3D button. Say it's an abstract method, void location, and maybe it's you're getting a location for a 3 dimensional button. So this is also abstract. So an interface extends another interface. So you'll have 3 dimension extending button. So if you want to use a 3 dimensional button in your form, what you're going to do is you're going to go and implement 3 dimension. When you implement a 3 dimensional button, it is mandatory you specify the implementation for all the 4 methods. So now let us go and implement class say we'll have class form implements 3 dimension. So we'll implement this 3 dimension. So once when you are going to implement a 3 dimension button in your form, what you're going to do is you go to source, override implement methods. So what it does is it is going to add all the methods, set button color from your button, set button text from your button, on click from your button, and location from your 3 dimension interface. So all the 4 methods should be implemented in your class form. So an interface can inherit another interface. There can be another interface which inherits this interface. So you can have multi levels of inheritance with interfaces. Likewise, interface 2 dimensional button can also extend button. A location for a 2 dimensional button can be only x and y axis, whereas a 3 dimensional button can be 3 parameters x, y, z, something like that. So that's how you have inheritance between interfaces. So you have class, we'll also have an interface 2 dimension, interface 2 dimension here. Say 2 dimension button also extends button. And here also you're going to have this function void location. Say we'll have some parameters here. We'll get x and y. So you have an interface 2 dimension extending button, 3 dimension extending button. Next, what we are going to do is we are going to implement both 3 dimension and 2 dimension buttons in our form. It's not only 2 dimension. I want both a 2D button and a 3D button in my form. I mean, a class can implement multiple interfaces. So what you do here is, see, normally a class cannot extend multiple classes, but a class can implement multiple interfaces. So form implements 3 dimension, comma 2 dimension. So now it's very important that you give the definition for this abstract method, and all these abstract methods in your form, because the form implements both the interfaces. So now let us go and do source override implement methods. So a class can implement multiple interfaces, but a class cannot extend multiple classes. So this is the only way through which you can achieve multiple inheritance. So I am inheriting the qualities of 3D button and also a 2D button in my class form. So multiple inheritance is again one difference between an abstract class and interface. In interface, you can achieve multiple inheritance, but in an abstract class, it's not possible to achieve multiple inheritance. So that's about an interface. I believe that you have some fair idea about an interface now. So now we'll talk about default method in interfaces. They had this problem with interfaces. What is the problem? You will go back to our code. We have completed our code, right? We have written some piece of code. Our system is ready. Later on, we found that the button interface is not complete. We want to add something more to our button interface after a project is implemented. And say I want to add something like that. Say I want to display a test message. I want to add one more test method here. Just say I want to add one more abstract test method to my button interface. Everything is prone to changes. So once when I go and perform this, what will happen? There will be a problem with all the classes that implement my button, right? Because we are not given the implementation for test. So it becomes a big problem. See, class form throws an error because we don't have the definition for test defined in class form. Likewise, you'll have class reservation also throwing an error because we didn't provide the definition for test. Likewise, class cancellation also will be throwing an error. See, you can have a button extensively used across many of your forms across a huge project. You just change this button interface by adding one method. Every class you have to go and change. It will be a very big, huge change. So what they thought was, okay, it becomes a very serious problem. Later on, they was rethinking and they thought, okay, we can have a method definition for certain methods in an interface. They are defining the property of an interface, right? They say we can have definition for a method inside the interface. So what you have to do is, for such methods you have to give default. You have to say it's default void test, and then you can go and give a method body here. So you can just go and give some. So you can give a body, and then you can say I just display a test message, that is this is test method. So what I am trying to say is, I have included another method. I can also give the body for this method, implementation for this method, but there is one rule. I have to say this method is default. So when I perform this, what will happen is, you'll see the errors in the classes are gone. See, it's not mandatory for the classes to override the default method, but if a certain class needs the default method, say a class form somehow wants to override this default method, it can override it. So you have to write code for that. Say in form alone, I want to use default. So what I can do is, I can just go and create override the default method. Say it's a public method, public void. And what is that method we gave? I think it's test, right? I can just go and override it here. So this is test overridden. So what we are achieving here is, wherever you're going to implement that particular method, in whichever class you're going to implement, only those classes you're going to override. The other classes will not be impacted by just adding this method. So you understood the use of default keyword here. See, I can provide a method without impacting all the classes in my system that implement this interface. There is a way to also call this default method directly from your class that is implementing this interface. So there is a class, say I will keep things very simple here. Let me have a class immediately implementing my class test1 implements button. Okay. So this class implements my button interface. So we'll override all the methods here. What I want to do is, from test1, I want to directly call this test method. You got it? I don't want to give a new definition for this method in my class. I want to just directly call, like super dot that particular method. So how can I do that is, from within my onClick method here, what I will do is, I will just call button dot super dot, and then I'll call this method test. So when I do this, what happens is, this will just go and call this method directly from your interface. It's going to execute this method in your class where you're calling it. So let us go and create an object of type test1. Let's call onClick. Let's see whether this method really gets executed. So what we'll do is, we'll just go and create an object of type test1. How will you create an object? New object you create test1. T is equal to new test1. Now I'll do t dot onClick. So this should actually, what it should do, it should go and invoke this particular method in my default method in my interface. I should get this is a test method printed. So let's go and execute this and see whether this one works. So either you can override that method, but you want to directly use that method in your class, you can use it by using interface name dot super dot whatever method name. That's what I have done here.